Viewers, you are welcome to our program, Eyewitness. As you are aware, this is a conversation we have weekly with Nigerians who have made significant contributions to the public good, to communities, people who have devoted their life to issues of concern, to issues that are useful to society. It is therefore a different narrative from the different narratives you hear about Nigeria, about corruption, about self-aggrandizement, about self-help. We believe there are so many Nigerians who have that other story to tell. Our theme today is the complexity of Hausa society. And we have brought a guest who has been studying in depth the complexity of Hausa society for the past 61 years. He is a professor of history, a leading anthropologist who has been in and out of Nigeria for the past 61 years. And that's why we've conscripted him as a Nigerian citizen to qualify him for this conversation. Prof, you are welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. I like the thought of being a Nigerian honorary citizen.
You know, I have powers that I can confer on people. Normally, Raf Aregbeshola, the Minister of Internal Affairs, is the person with that right, but I've borrowed it temporarily. So, Professor Murray Last, you are welcome to this program, which, as I've just explained, is about the public good. We'll start by getting you to introduce yourself. What's your background? Where were you born? Where did you go to school? And how old were you when you took that decision to come to Nigeria?
Yes, well, I was born in 1937 in Edgbaston, where my father had started the BBC Talks programme in the Midlands, which was a more liberal place than London for the BBC. So he was there, but he moved on and became a civil servant. So we moved to London, basically. But I was sent to boarding schools in the usual way in England for middle-class people. So I went to Harrow School, and my next-door neighbour in the corridor where my room was the Crown Prince of Jordan, Hussein. And I admit we used to tease him. He was about 15 years old, so he was slightly older than I was. And we would tease him and say, there are two men asking for you. And that would send him rush back to his room, to his bottom drawer, and bring out two revolvers. And that was our but he, to be honest, he moved on, and I didn't. So I went to Cambridge and was reading classics, ancient Greek, ancient Latin, although I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, I was tutored in Oxford, so I would take the railway line direct from Oxford to Cambridge and Cambridge to Oxford. And it was only then that I got a grant, which I didn't apply for. I tend not to apply for things, but I was given this grant by surprise to go to Yale and for 2 years. So I spent much of the time in Yale traveling around the USA, but hitchhiking, which was always quite an odd thing. Americans don't like hitchhikers for good reason. But at Yale, I was doing Chinese history because there were two very good professors of Chinese, and my fellow student from Cambridge specialized in Chinese and has become a very well-known author on Chinese textbooks. But I also was persuaded by my Yale fellow students, not as a graduate, but undergraduates, to go and listen to the lectures of what is his name, on Cameroonian history, African history. And what was interesting was that no one was teaching the history of Africa. And what was enjoyable was that he was just a very nice, very ardent man. And his name now comes back to me, of course. It's Harry Rudin, R-U-D-I-N. He was more enthusiastic. Anyway, but the other people with me who became quite big politicians in the US, the Bowles family and the Celeste family, it was suggested to me that I should apply for a grant to actually go to Nigeria, a Leverhulme grant. And very nicely, Sir Eric Ashby said he would write a reference for me. And so I never was interviewed. On the whole, I neither apply nor get interviewed. So I think it was in Allah's plan, God's plan, anyone's plan, but it landed on me a 2-year grant to go to the only university in Nigeria, UCI, University College Ibadan, where, of course, I was put in Sultan Bello Hall, along with people like Roland Adelais, who was quite an actor in those young days. He was the first to play Brother Jero, the preacher on Bar Beach. And so my teachers there, the main one who was interested in the Islamic world of Bornu in particular, and Sokoto, was a man called H.F.C. Smith, whose father had actually been a policeman on the Westminster beat, but he himself had grown up in Croydon, where he won prizes. But he had learned Arabic by being a teacher in the Sudan, but he'd actually got interested in Islam, seriously interested in Islam, when he was a signals officer in the British Army in India, and he sort of attached himself to a sheikh there. So that's where Smith's sort of interest, expertise.
That's Abdullah Smith.
He converted after the...
Converted to Islam and then got renamed Abdullah Smith.
Yes, but he actually formally converted in 1966 after the coup. He was quite shaken by the coup. So he went up to Sokoto to see the Tafida, whom his wife, she could marry him once he had converted. His wife was related to. And so he became a Muslim in Sokoto. I assume he went to the second Muslim. But I remember sort of chatting to him about it. So it was Smith that basically used to give me seminars every Wednesday evening from about 7 o'clock till 9, 10 o'clock. And he just poured out his ideas and the rest. Smith himself didn't speak Hausa, so he never really did field work. The only field work he really had done for a short time was in Maiduguri, but he simply he had trouble communicating with his wife for that reason. Anyway, but he was a good man, serious man.
Well, since we've arrived in Sokoto, can we just jump to the Sokoto Caliphate? Legend has it that you coined the term Sokoto Caliphate during your doctoral study. Is that legend true?
It is true, and therefore not a legend. It's a fact. So people prefer theories these days to fact. But no, the point is, as I'm sure everyone listening to this knows, the standard term for the state ruled from Sokoto was the Fulani Empire. Now you must go back to, in your mind, to the 1960s, when Zeke was in Government House, when Awo and Opara and the Sardona were all very much the figures that people were interested in. And many of my friends who looked after me in Kaduna, where I was reading in the archives, they let me have a key so I could work there till 11, 12 o'clock in the night. But what was interesting was that the people I was with, Adamu Chiroma, Daru Modibo Gire, and others, were all in the early days of the Sardona's administration in the northern region. So you couldn't refer to Sokoto's state as the Fulani Empire. We were anti-ethnocentrism, so one wasn't really interested in Fulani or things. Secondly, we certainly didn't think of it as an empire. We are interested in a Muslim name for a state. You could have called it the Sokoto Sultanate, but it was the British colonials who referred to the second Muslim as Sultan, and we didn't want to take their name. It's important to recognize that the only sultans in the 19th century northern Nigeria was the Emir of Kano, was addressed in correspondence from Sokoto as Sultan Kano. I think once or twice Second Zazo was so called. Anyway, we couldn't, to be honest, call it the Sokoto Sultanate. So what would you call it? We might have used the Hausa term Daula Sokoto, but that wasn't appropriate for a book that was going to be published in English. So it was Smith who I think used to occasionally think of in his lectures, which I didn't go to, as a possible caliphate. And he suggested to me about 1964 that, well, what do we call the book? The thesis was just simply Sokoto in the 19th century, with special reference to the vizier. And so the argument came, well, he wanted the Caliphate of Sokoto, and I said, that doesn't sound as good as the Sokoto Caliphate. So it was my choice, but the inspiration was, I think, really, to be honest, HFC Smith, Abdullah Smith. And I went up of course, as I did, to the Wazir in Sokoto, Al-Haji Junaid do, and sort of got his permission to use that term. But we all know it wasn't the term that the Sokotawa themselves used. You simply refer to the second Muslim, the Amir al-Mu'minin, as that second Muslim, not as a caliph. Though Waziri Junaidu did occasionally use it, and very rarely it occurs in some of the jihadi manuscripts. But one last footnote, of course, is that the only other West African caliph had been the Mai of Bornu, who had been given that title by the Sultan of Egypt. And so my argument is that when the jihadi fighters expelled the Mai of Bornu from his city, Benin, in Gazagamu, then there was no caliphate. So Sokoto inherited the title. But you don't have to believe all this. Let's simply, it's your state, it's your ancestors, and since Nigerians have taken to the term Sokoto Caliphate, use it. It's your past, not mine.
Thank you, Professor Last. I want to tell our viewers that there is an edition that has been published in Nigeria. I think it's by Premium Times, and it's available. That famous book, The Sokoto Caliphate, by our guest, Professor More Last, is now available in Nigeria. Those of you who haven't read it, please go and buy a copy and read it.
Can I just add one
Yes,
footnote
please,
to that? First, beware, reading it will turn your hair grey. But more importantly, the point of the book is really the second half, which focuses on the vizierate administration. And the purpose of that was to refocus away from the second Muslim and kings and rulers and fighting, and look at how the new government of Sokoto was set up as a bureaucracy with officials and letter writing and secretaries and messengers. And in that sense, the whole focus on the Sokoto administration was just as an inspiration to the Sardaunia's administration of the new northern Nigeria. But people seem to focus much more on the actual jihad. But if you are interested in how the pre-colonial government worked, then turn to the second half and your hair will go even grayer. But
okay, I don't want their hair to grow gray. Give us 2 or 3 key lessons on how the Sokoto Caliphate was administered. What strikes you as being significant knowledge about that system?
I think the key point is that it was largely decentralized, so that the second Muslim was the top of it, and you couldn't execute anyone without him agreeing. The right to execution was his alone, and anyone who executed someone and didn't ask him was a rebel by definition. But perhaps the most important thing was the sense to which there was a lot of depending on trust, in the sense of amana, but not just treaties with none, but that there was a trust, and that initially the Shehu Uthman Danfodio appointed Modibe. He wasn't so sure he could trust Hausa Malams, most of whom were Wangarawa Malams. And it's very important to keep in mind that in some ways the sheikh who most disliked the rival ulama, the ulama al-Sur, because they were corrupt. They had supported the Hausa rulers. So in some ways, the appointment of Modibe was that he could trust them not to be corrupted into supporting big men, rulers. Of course, so that decentralization meant that he entrusted Kano, Zozo, Daura, Katsina to Modibe, who weren't really administrators. They weren't Jarume. They weren't military men. So what can you do? So the Waziri was basically trying to help supervise, along with the Galadima and the Magajin Rafi, in fact, with some of the others. But basically the Waziri had most of the administration, and he would go on tour. And whenever he crossed the forests between Zamfara and Katsina, he would write, when he came there, a letter saying, "I've got through safely." And just as drivers from Funtua to Gusau might send a similar note now, "I've survived." But my point is that his skill was diplomacy. It's important to recognize that the Sokoto Caliphate had no army, no professional army of its own. They never ever united, not even against the Nasara. They never united a single huge army. So the Sokoto army was a voluntary army. People joined the jihad or joined a campaign because they were willing to. And I have to admit, by the 1820s, people were tired of fighting, and they rather liked the luxuries that came with triumph. And so Mohammed Bello, the second Muslim, complained bitterly that he couldn't raise a proper army. But I like to think the Sokoto Caliphate was not a militaristic state. It wasn't like Ashanti or places like that, where the whole idea was a professional army with professional leaders. We don't actually know who the man, the sheikh who appointed as Amir al-Jaysh, second Yaki, what his background was, whether he had ever experienced in war. He probably wasn't a Malemi, a Modibo, because he didn't behave like one, to be honest. So don't tell that too loudly to your friends in Sokoto. So there was a real problem of men who had joined the jihad, possibly for monetary reasons. It's one of the dilemmas that if as a pullo herder with cattle, that if you lose your cattle through an epidemic or through something else, a disaster, the only other job awaiting you, possible for you, is to act as a mercenary. Because any pullo on his own with a herd has to be able to fight off not just other people, but lions and anything else. So there is a tradition of being a tough guy. And Second Dutsi in Kano used them in order to defeat Second Kano. I mean, it goes back to the 18th century and before. Anyway, so the end result, coming back to Sokoto, was that the jihadi army, the Mujahideen, as I like to call them, comprised a lot of cattleless, Fulbe, Fulani, who were quite interested in what spoils and captives they could take. And that's where the problem came, because Abdullahi thought anything like luxurious silks or music were totally wrong. And the Shehu, influenced, I think, by his son Mohammed Bello, thought one could permit it. And as many of you may well know, that Abdullahi Danfodio was so disgusted with the way the jihad was moving. Even some of the jihadi forces Bello himself called muharibun, brigands. So Abdullahi abandoned the jihad and went to Kano, where he actually did the tafsir in Ramadan, and in 1806. But he was persuaded by the Kanawa to come back. He wanted to go on the Hajj. So he did go. He went with about 2 or 3 friends and 5 servants. I like the idea, but you wouldn't go on a Hajj without your servants. Anyway, sorry, I'm going on.
Yeah,
too
just
long.
for 1 minute, tell us a bit about Waziri Junaidu, who you worked with and who had a lot of knowledge on how the Sokoto Caliphate operated.
Yes, Waziri Junaidu was one of these informal men who actually loved creating poetry, particularly when listening to speakers. When Akintala was speaking in Yoruba and the Waziri couldn't understand it, he would compose poetry for himself. So the Waziri had a sense of humor. He was very learned in that understated way. He actually knew and insisted that his sons learned full day, which was rare then in Sokoto. He was a jurisprudent as well as everything else. But the nicest thing about him was that if I asked him a question and he didn't know the answer, he would simply say, "I don't know," and encouraged me to go and try to find the answer. And if I did find the answer, to come back and tell him. And he would then tell me if that was probably true or
That's the
wasn't.
mindset of a scholar.
Oh, absolutely. And he had the clothing of a scholar. He would put up with me at about 5 p.m. every evening, sitting in the Zawri on the floor with his shirt wide open and just very happy to chat.
Thank you, Professor Last. Viewers, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Viewers, you are welcome back to our conversation with Professor Murray Last on the complexity that's Hausa society. more or less knows what he's talking about. He's been studying Hausa society for the last 61 years. Professor Last, one of the most fascinating things about your career is that you have looked at Hausa society from the top, the organization of the Sokoto Caliphate, and how it had ramifications throughout all the zone that Caliphate exists. But you've also, as we used to say in Bordeaux, studied Hausa society from the bottom, from the village level. And in particular, since 1970, you've studied a Maguza community in Kankara, local government of Katsina State. And our viewers want to know, why would this grand historian whose life has been famous because of that work on the Sokoto Caliphate, spend so many decades studying just one small village community? What was the motivation?
I think it comes back to, I was driving after I finished the Sokoto Caliphate around a lot of northern Nigeria, trying to find manuscripts in Fulfulde, Ajami, as well as Arabic ones, to realize I didn't have any clue as to what the Shehu Danfodio had for breakfast. I know that sounds stupid, but I do like to know the details of real life rather than just the theories. But more important was that the Biafran civil war was starting, and my Sokoto Caliphate work was being used a little bit as part of the dividing Nigeria up, because my Igbo friends saw it as a wicked state led by a wicked Sardona. So I realized that there was another subject that I really didn't know anything about, but nor did, it seems, anyone else. Because in the 1967, 66, 67, a new medical school was being started in ABU. And what was interesting in Zaria, of course, the hospital was the old city not the city hospital, but the anyway, the hospital there. And it was very clear that neither the doctors or surgeons or the nurses knew what was troubling their patients, who were all Hausa. And I went to my vice-chancellor, Audu, who was himself a
Professor
doctor.
Isha Audu.
Yes, Isha Audu. He, and I said, I think I ought to try to make a Hausa medical dictionary so people would, as it were, know what their patients were saying, but above all, that their students in the medical school would be oriented towards understanding your patients who might be very ill, but you still had to talk to them and speak with them. So the question then came is, where should I go? I actually retrained to do the, I went back to London to retrain, to do a study on medical anthropology, a subject which in those days didn't exist. So I was very lucky that I found a department that was willing to teach me a subject that didn't exist. But I did drive across from Kano to London in my two-engined motor car, an engine in the back and an engine in the front. And I drove back, of course, because I needed the car. And the place I decided to go to, Malumfashi had a cottage hospital for ABU, so ABU students could go to a rural place. So, in short, I found a Muslim village there, Dankanjiba. It was a rather nice place, and it had a market, but far away enough. And I did a survey of the health of all 131 households. And what became very clear, having done it all, it was just me, it wasn't, I didn't have an assistant or anything else, was that the households with the most ill health I had seen about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. The households with the least ill health were those I saw about 12 noon or 1 o'clock. And the reason was straightforward. The ones by 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, were desperate to go and have lunch or do something. And so my argument is that all these surveys that is called quantitative this and that is probably total rubbish. My 131 interviews were interesting, but particularly interesting because ill health decreases the closer it gets to lunchtime. And I recommend that to any of you who are sociologists to always note what time of the day you do the interview. But the real problem in Dankanjiba was, of course, I could only speak to the men. I wasn't, obviously, as a Muslim house, allowed inside the house. So I then went to a Fulbe Ruga, a Fulani camp, thinking that I could at least speak to the women there. But to be honest, the Pulu head of the house said, no, you can't. You can speak to us, but you can't interview. In any case, to be honest, I couldn't have managed full day, even though most of them did actually speak Hausa because they are just down the road from Dankanjiba. So where can you find a community where a single man, he happens to be white, but that's not the point, can talk to women of the house and hear what illnesses they have and their children have? Because almost 90% of all illness is experienced by women and children. And in those days, the mortality rate amongst the children in the household that did take me in was 50%.
Wow, that's very high.
It's extremely high. And what was interesting is that in a household of where one man might have not just 4 wives, but might have 6 wives, it varied often. One wife would have 9 out of her 11 children alive, and a co-wife, same water, same air, same patch of ground, would have 9 of her 11 children dead. So there was a very real problem. And what was very nice was, of course, this household that would let me in were a Maguzawa household in the old style, with a Megiddo who was obviously quite, in his old, though very old, was quite a radical. Whereas the other half of the house, the Megiddo, who reputedly had a dodo attached to him, was opposed to my being there. But I lived for 2 years within that house with my own room. And the advantage is not only did I chat and joke and they teased me the whole time, but the children would, of course, tell me things. I could ask them things which their parents might not have wanted. And of course, I saw Bori and Girka, the initiation into Bori. And the woman I saw initiated, I still see her when I go back to this farmstead and tease her. She's of course Tartuba, and her husband did, and all the rest. In fact, her husband went on the Hajj. But it was interesting that to see Bori as it is properly done, not as play, not as wasa, but as therapeutic. Because, of course, in any big house, big farmstead, you have severe sorrows as well as joys, as well as jokes. And in some ways, it was interesting to see how Bori was used as therapy. And it did actually work, not surprisingly. They had better access and knew how to make it work better than... And the trouble with people who write about Bori is that they've never lived with it. As I did it, all this girka took place within 10 yards of my door. And the
Will they climb the roof and...
None of that.
I like that drama part.
Oh, well, that is more wasa Bori.
Okay, it's not the real thing.
Particularly for the tourists. The Americans think they're doing the real thing, but it's purely for show. Just as in Kano, if it's become a cultural thing, so it's not un-Islamic. But to say that these Maguzawa believed in Iskoki or worshipped them is just not true. Because, of course, Iskoki are in the Quran. I mean, Al-Janu are in the Quran. So, of course, they're Al-Janu in the house the whole time. And you need to be polite to them. And so when you sweep a floor, you say, Gafrede, Gafrede, because you may be sweeping a jinn who doesn't want to be. And when you get into the bed that you're going to lie on, you rub your hand over the sheet and say, Gafrede, to get the iskoke off the sheet. Or similarly with hot water, when you put hot water into a bowl, you ask the iskoke to move away. So you live with iskoke. But so, to be honest, do the good Muslims have been in Kano. They may not fully realize it, but iskoke are always there. They move, in case you want to know, from east to west, Hele, which is why, of course, you always put butcher's slabs out on the west side of a marketplace. In fact, a market should be on the west of a village, because the Iskoki like blood, amongst other things. And you don't want to have the Iskoki filled coming into your house, so you put the market and the butchers on the west side as they head on. But there's a whole spiritual Iskoki geography to plot. You can map the roots of the Iskoki from which tree to that tree to that tree. And a field below that root you can buy cheaper than a field that is not under a root of Iskoki.
So there's a whole science of the location of Iskoki in a settlement.
Oh, yes, indeed. But to be honest, I say field prices can be cheaper under an Iskoki, but you'd be slightly unwise to have one under a main Iskoki route. But, I mean, there's all this sort of dimensions of living with. I mean, the reason why when sanitary vehicles clear up the rubbish within Bin in Kano, there's a bit of concern, because where do the Iskoki go? Iskoki love rubbish. So we put our rubbish outside the house, where the Iskoki can be safely outside the house. But if you remove all the rubbish from the streets, the Iskoki will have to come into the house and give you trouble.
That's serious.
The sanitary powers don't know the whole side, and it's not me inventing it. It's self-evident. So rubbish and Iskoki. Children are not troubled by Iskoki, so they can play in rubbish and things, and the Iskoki like playing with old children. But because it's reckoned that Iskoki are actually quite playful. And so when you say Gafrede, they will make way for a human, an adult. But no, it's a whole different world, and rather different from the Gidan Waziri.
Now, I want us to remain in the terrain of geography. This time we'll move from the geography of Iskoki to the geography of the Sokoto Caliphate. Power is always associated with major urban centers, while power is removed from the rural areas. How did this play out in the Sokoto Caliphate?
Basically, you have to go back to Sheikh Uthman Dan Fodio, who didn't ever spend a night in Benin Al-Kalawa, the Benin go beer. Thanks. And when he did go to Al-Kalawa to borrow books, or possibly to buy them, but I think to borrow them from probably Wangarawa Malame, he took his son, Mohammed Bello, with him, which is why we know about it. And at the end of the day, he wouldn't sleep. No doubt they offered him accommodation. He left Benin Al-Kalawa and slept under a tree outside the city. They really did not like city life. But more dramatically was when the jihadi fighters conquered not only Al-Kalawa, but Benin Kebbi. None of the jihadi elite moved in to take over the houses or palaces. They took the loot, it's well known. Benin Kebbi gave the jihadis their best haul of loot. So Mohammed Bello says, but they never took over the palaces and the stuff. And what is interesting was the Sheikh Uthman allowed the emirs they appointed, the Modibe, to take over Kano city, Katsina city, Zaria city. But the jihadi elite themselves in Sokoto would never. And what I think is then important to recognize then is that they saw small settlements as outside in the bush as somehow less polluted. Of course, Bello built for Sheikh Uthman walls round Gwandu, which was then a valley in the midst of nowhere, and Bello built Sokoto. But he basically, when Sokoto became a birni, it became full of traders, caravan men, and riffraff, if you like. So you could gamble. In 1820s Sokoto, in Bello's time, you could gamble and womanize and drink in Sokoto. And I think people like Bello and the others didn't really like the way a big city becomes corrupt. So they built these ribaats. Even the town of Shagari is a thugar. which is a country fort. And they built a row of country places where you could set committed, enthusiastic young men to serve their entire lives there. And if they died in a ribat, they could be a martyr and would go to. They didn't have to fight to be a martyr, you just living in a ribat. So there's a real attempt to make rural, small strongholds in the countryside not only a defense in death, but a sacred place to go and live your life. And that is interesting, for one thing, for those of you who know Hausa political thought. For Hausa political thought, as Jibbo has been saying, power lies at the center, and the bigger the walls, the bigger the palace. So Kano was huge, with 30-foot high walls and 13 miles of walls. What bigger place can you be? But the Sokotawa inverted all that theory and say the real strength lay not in the city, but in the rural areas where these ribats, ribadu or sugar, thugra, were. And I think that's an interesting dimension of the jihad that doesn't get recognized. But one last point on the takeover of the cities in the jihad was that my theory is the Hausa rulers were not actually defeated. They were expelled, ejected from their cities. The reason is straightforward. Not a single one of the major cities, the major Sarakuna, decided to fight it out. There was no siege. In Kano, the Serki got out before there was a siege. Admittedly, he couldn't relocate. He got killed down in the south in the Borum, where his grave still is. But Sekin Zazo left early on Saturday morning, the 31st of December, 1808. And about an hour or two later, 70 Mujahideen, jihadi warriors rode in and took over Benin Zazo. The point is the second Zazo, the second Kano, the second Katsina, the second Daura, they all left in good order and set off to relocate. As we all know, second Zazo moved down to Abuja.
Yes.
So that what's interesting...
Which is now Suleja.
Which is now Suleja, indeed. But it's interesting that even the Mai of Bornu, in his huge mega city of Benin in Gazagamu, decided to move out and relocate, again in good order, to Kukau. So these mega cities that we all admire and want
are the concentration of evil.
The concentration of people, but it's a trap. And in a sense, no one wanted to be caught in a city trap. I'm not saying Abuja is a trap, though I have to admit it's been such a delightful place to be in that it's like honey. But anyway.
Thank you so much, Professor Morelast. It's been a fascinating discussion. Viewers, I hope you have a better understanding of the complexity of Hausa society, the jihad, the caliphate that emerged, and what happens in the rural parts of the caliphate. I think the most fascinating thing is the geography of Iskoki, which I'm hearing for the first time, and the question of the location of butchers is very, very important. I think I'll go out to the markets to see whether this principle enunciated by Professor Last is still being observed today. Thank you so much for your attention. We'll meet again next week.